The speaker is Brother Afroz, Imam Afroz. He doesn't really need an introduction. He is such a well-known figure in Australia. He's educated in Islamic studies, not in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, and a whole lot of other places. And he's not just your average religious leader. He is involved very heavily in community work, in youth-related projects, in interfaith projects, people of other faiths. When something goes wrong in Fiji, he is there. His organization is there. They're active across Australia, in Melbourne, and Sydney, and elsewhere. Always traveling. We always have difficulty in catching up with him. You know, where are you, Brother Afroz? Oh, I'm in the US. Next day I'm in Yemen. Next day I'm in Syria. I'm not Syria. Not Syria. That's a dangerous word. Anyway, he doesn't require any introduction. And I'm sure he will keep us entertaining and keep us awake. Thank you, Brother Afroz, for taking the time to speak. And he'll speak for about 30 minutes. We need a lot of discussion. And inshallah, thank you.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون صلى الله على سيدنا محمد ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I apologize, my throat is actually almost giving up on me, so I'm going to try and keep it as short as possible, as quick as possible, and probably not too fast that people can't understand, and hopefully the translation can work through, inshallah. عفوا سامحوني, we should be presenting أتكلم في اللغة العربية ولكن هذا صعب للساني والحمد لله رب العالمين. استغفر الله بارك الله فيك الحمد لله. So something that I wanted to actually start by saying is that I actually don't have the answers to start off with. Point number one, I think that's the first thing I wanted to mention. But I can share with you first and foremost what I would call a paradigm shift. We as a Muslim community in Australia, we need to think differently by understanding what exactly is happening and how do we understand even terms like radicalization, and something which I'll be starting with as soon as we sort of get into it. What is radicalization? Because it's very simple to say, this is a radical idea, but radical ideas are not necessarily always bad. So we have to be aware of that in itself. The second thing is that something which I don't necessarily share too widely in public, but I'm very happy to share it here, is that the Al-Ghazali Center, which is now Seekers Hub Global, we actually have had a program for the last approximately 7 years now, in which we have 240 people who were essentially, qualitatively, people who we identified as people who were radical, people who were considered to be moving in a direction which may have led them to violent radicalization, to terrorism. And this was 240 people that we've been working for the last approximately 7 years, sorry. And I might add that that is without any government funding. So we've done it ourselves. And what we have found is that of the 240 people, 120, exactly half of them, that we are absolutely sure are people who have changed their paradigm, have changed their thinking and their mindset because they have been able to hear another narrative. And this is something that the first speaker was really strongly speaking about, that we need to have, the voices must speak about a holistic way of understanding this world, and obviously from our filters of Islam, without a doubt. But it must be understood in a holistic way and not in a piecemeal way, in a kind of a reactive manner to the socio-political circumstances that we see around the world. The third point I actually wanted to make is that we have a difficult task in front of us, because the difficult task is the realities that we have to face in the world today, right? We have to acknowledge that I want to be able to make sure that when I finish speaking in approximately 30 minutes time, that inshallah, by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's a kind of a consensus that it's not only actually about reducing or fighting or being in a kind of rivalry against this idea of terrorism and a kind of a radicalization, because it's not only a community responsibility, it's also, as I was asking the question in the beginning, that we have to recognize and we have to be people who have the courage to be able to speak to government in a constructive manner, that their actions are actually leading to some of these problems as well. And we cannot shy away from that. But we need to be able to do it in a manner which is civil, we need to be able to do it in a manner which is constructive, and we need to do it in a manner which is legally permissible in Australia. It's very, very important. And that's the reason why I want to first look at some myths that need to be broken. I think first, number one, I wanted to look at some insights that, that psychologists and social scientists out there look at when they consider radicalization and they look at terrorism, and by understanding those models, how we can act within our communities with certain strategies, and ultimately some suggestions, if I have, for the authorities themselves. And in this regard, it's not going to be a short-term answer. We don't have a I don't have a short-term answer. When I look at my experience of the last 7 or 8 years, and I'll share some of those experiences as I go along, the amount of energy that the Imams, that you all are placing in trying to counter this problem is inspirational. Because the problem is a juggernaut of a problem. And I know many of you over here who, say Dr. Abdullah was talking about me traveling. Some of you are twice as busy as I think I am, because what you do for the community. And so the issue is not easy, and we really have to get ourselves prepared and ready, because things are not going to get any easier. When you look at what has happened in Boston, I was reading an article yesterday released by the Global Forum, which is an interesting forum that we'll be speaking about in a few minutes. And they released an article yesterday, and they said exactly what Dr. Abdullah said, that the next problem the Muslims have to deal with is the normalcy of Islam. That's you and I. In other words, we are no longer going to be talking about the so-called extreme nature of people in any social, political, or religious organization and entity, but whether we as Muslims are even trustworthy, whether we have a place as citizens in these countries that we find ourselves in. And this is the Global Forum already mentioning this within 48 to 72 hours of the bombing in Boston. So we have work actually cut out in front of us. So let's look at the breaking of the myths first, and I apologize of some of the controversial points that might be made over here. Nelson Mandela was a radical as well. I just wanted to first make a point that radical ideas is not a bad idea. We need radical ideas. We actually need to help this Australian society to think that in fact we as Muslims can present constructive ideas. We have to be radicals. We have to be people who can, in a very constructive manner, be able to actually do that. We should be able to do that. Now, I'll just make this point of here. He was prepared to kill or be killed in his cause. I'm not suggesting that we do that. Well, I'm just wanting you to understand that there is a paradigm here of what he stood for. What he stood for in relation to what South Africa was all about. And we have to learn not the killing part, but it seems like we know how to do that bit. We need to learn how the civil discourse must be held so that it can be given a place of mainstream understanding and acknowledgement. That we are not just kind of a side point over here that is being made, that Muslims are just whinging about all of this. That in fact we have a proposition that is going to make this country, this Australia, a better place for all people concerned. I mean, this is really shocking if you look at this next person over here. People like to think that Gandhi was kind of a peace-loving guy, and he was. He was, but listen to this statement over here. I'd rather die killing than be killed in silence by my oppressor. Why do I bring this up? I bring this up to the table that we have to realize that according to Global Forum, this is what I was sharing before, that 98.4% of all terrorism that actually occurs does not arise from some vacuum. In other words, we actually don't have this group of a bunch of people out there who are going, you know, I just don't care about humanity. I just want to bomb somebody. It actually doesn't work like that. That in fact people are rising with what I would call potentially reasonable grievances, which leads to violence if we do not intervene in between. When people from Somalia, when people from Mali, when people from Indonesia, you know, President Guzman, ex-President Guzman, when Australia had a bit of a rift with East Timor in relation to the gas situation, and Australia was not letting, according to East Timor, Australia was not letting East Timor have enough gas. And so there was a pressure upon Mr. Guzman to establish democracy as quickly as possible, this idea of democracy. Mr. Guzman had a brilliant response to the situation, and this is very applicable to what is going on in the world, and we, in this whole conversation, we cannot forget the plight of people. We cannot forget the plight of people. He said, Mr. Guzman, how can we think of democracy if our people are still going to bed hungry? Right? And this kind of a plight and this kind of a thinking that exists in the world, and this is the reason why I was saying before, is to how can we get our Foreign Affairs Department as one example, but the entire government, to start thinking that in fact there could be other solutions to what people are experiencing out there, to the extent that no more than 2.5% to 3% of the people who are going out bombing out there, which includes all terrorism, not only Islamic, Muslim-based terrorism, who simply have no regard and simply are doing what they're doing because they just consider this to be something, a kind of a violent act that they want to do. 98.4% of the people are rising from some grievance that could be considered to be illegitimate. And we have people like this who actually had such grievances as well, who stood for some pretty amazing statements that, you know, today we consider people like Gandhi to be important. And we cannot forget this equation in the history of humanity. So what we want to be able to be careful to actually understand is that radicalization actually is not a pathway to jihad. Radicalization is not a pathway to jihad. There are two sides to radicalization, which I'll be speaking about as we go along, and we need to understand that. I humbly disagree with the first speaker, this idea of jihadi radicals. In Islam, jihad has a sacred meaning, and you and I have a responsibility to bring the most accurate, the most appropriate meaning of that into the mainstream understanding. So as I speak about all of this, I want to continue to speak about what our responsibilities and what we actually can do. And I personally believe that this particular forum, and I think this was one of the first, when we had the first workshop, we discussed about having a website where you could actually collect a whole bunch of resources that becomes available for us to be able to provide to people. It's very, very important that this kind of thinking is in fact not, that we somehow jihadize, if I could use the term, jihadize terrorism. You know, we have a responsibility. This, in fact, this doesn't actually happen. The second is that radicalization is not a kind of an orderly series of stages leading to violence. This is actually shown by psychologists and social scientists over and over and over again. A very common thought is, and we will see this diagram in a few minutes, there's a person sort of has some kind of a grievance, then he meets some bunch of radical people, and then he corroborates with this group and becomes a group member, and then he has this leader who tells him to go and bomb somebody, and they go and bomb. Actually, it's not like that in most of the cases at all. The research shows us that so many of these people, for example, the example of Stockholm, the example of the London bombing, and quite a few of those, many of these people were people who actually ultimately acted out of no particular orderly series and stages of development into radicalization. So you and I, what do you and I take from this? The radicalization could be happening right in front of you. If the right narrative, or at least a diverse ability, the diverse nature of the narrative of Islam is not presented to people, we're going to have radicalization happening right in front of us. And I have seen that myself, where people who have of the 240 people, we actually have asked all of these people as to why they considered it was, these people were prepared to go to Afghanistan, these people were prepared to actually go to Iraq, These people are going to prepared to go to Philippines. These people are prepared to actually go to some of the African countries. So we asked them a question, and the question was, so why do you want to do this? And a common answer, not the entire absolute answer, but the common answer was, listen to this carefully. Our Imams don't give an answer to our questions. And this is a very telling problem for us. How do we attend that? Inshallah, we will be looking at further down. And some of these people, I'm talking about engineers and architects, accountants and architects here, who created this kind of a, if I could call it, defeatist mentality, and said, well, if there's no answer, apparently the only answer is go and kill a few people, because nobody else is listening to us, right? And in that is also connected to the idea of, paradisial entry and, heroism in this world and all that kind of stuff as well. But by far and large, this drive of not having the right answer can flip people around so quickly. And today's world is quite a fast-moving world in which this can be a problem. And radicalization is obviously not terrorism. In fact, plenty of evidence exists, in fact, that people who become radical in their thinking, in the negative sense of radicalization, most of them do not actually act upon it at all. It's a very small number of people who act upon it. What do we take from that? That we have the capacity, we have the opportunity to change this. Because by nature, most of those people do not actually go and become violent, which means that if we intervened the right way, we could actually change it even quicker. Right? So those are the 4 points I actually wanted to make in that regard. So here's a model which is very commonly used in various researchers, which I disagree with most of the psychologists, in fact, actually disagree with, because it is not this straightforward when we speak about radicalization. The idea is, there's this, what they say is the first idea, the first place is this idea of pre-radicalization. In a time when people are just living normal lives, they're aware of what's happening in the world, but they're not necessarily connected to any particular cause in itself. And then something might actually happen in their lives which forces them to actually identify with a particular cause. And this could be, say, for example, somebody who says it's unacceptable for the United States government to be taking the resources out of Congo, as an example, and therefore they would then act on these causes in some way. But because they become so focused in a particular issue, they become marginalized in the mosques. So one of the questions that before that Dr. Abdullah was asking about these people who feel marginalized in their mosques and actually moving out of that mosque, actually creating a little center, a lot of the times it is because what they're trying to make sense of, nobody is actually responding to them. They're not responding to them in a manner where they can actually have the answers, and if not the answers, at least they're not having a dialogue that allows them to in fact actually do so. And this is something which is considered in psychology what they call cognitive crisis, where they're unable to make sense of something. And this is one of the most vulnerable times of people, when they come to this point of time that anyone who can influence them, they will be able to actually get them in, and they will be able to indoctrinate them, because they're so confused. They're not getting the right answers. And I'll speak about later on as to what we should do about this, inshallah. So what happens from here is, because whoever now speaks to them, and if they're able to convince such a person, they will be able to actually bring them into a radical worldview. They will be able to indoctrinate them to this idea. And I have to say, and please forgive me if you disagree with me, please discuss with me later on. And remember, this model is not necessarily correct, and that's what I'm trying to present over here. I'm just saying that what they're saying, we'll be looking at what exactly in some cases actually does actually happen. The point here is that in this radical worldview, one of the amazing statements of these 240 people who are mentioning, who are dealing with us and continue to deal with us, mention that one of the reasons, one of the ways they were able to make sense of wanting to go to jihad, commit an extremist act, etc. One of the reasons why they were doing this, and this is another very important thing for us to actually understand, is because that's what they heard, or they thought they heard, in masjid khutbas. Now, I'm talking about 240 people. I don't think it's a small number of people, but it's still a small number of people, right? You may have a very different experience of that. I'm speaking that of these 240 people, a lot of them mention that they have been, through this cognitive crisis, been given a reason to think like this from what they're hearing inside mosques. Right? So this is the point they're actually making. And this is the time when you also look at, according to the model, that these people actually start to become part of a group, and this group aspect is very, very important, something that the first speaker actually spoke about, because it gives them strength, it gives them the ability to build the energy, and so forth. And I also want to make a point over here that one of the things we have to look at is how the superiors or the senior scholars are actually instructing the younger and the junior ones. This is one of the things that in fact is impacting the people, and so instructions from the superior is making an impact upon people. And then obviously from there it goes to this, what they call jihadization, where people are going to not only sort of be part of a group, but they're now actually committed to an ideology, and in fact will actually accept any duty that in fact has been given, asked to actually be given to them, and it could lead to violence in itself. And the point is that many people can actually lead to jihadization, but not ultimately act on it. If I can also mention over here, in my experience of Sydney, I'm not quite sure of Melbourne and other places, I have had the misfortune of Alhamdulillah, by God's praise and grace, that we have been able to sit down and talk, but I've actually met with centers in Sydney who consider themselves what they call themselves jihadi entities. In other words, on the one hand, there are people with grievances and they become what they become. But we have to remember and we have to accept, I have met these people, that there are people who are actually propagating jihadi messages, that they are actually existent till today, and they continue to actually do so. And this is a problem that we actually have to deal with. And we have to reach out to these people. We can't marginalize them. We have to go and talk to these people and have a discourse in this regard. I have had some lukewarm responses to some of the brothers who have varied kinds of I suppose assumption about myself, an opinion about myself. But the point being is that by engaging with them, I believe that they're in fact changing their views, and we have to actually do so. These red dots, what do they mean? In each one of these stages is where radicalization actually happens. And there is some external party that does it. And it is some person in our community or outside our community, meaning outside of Australia, who actually fuels this process. And we have to be aware of that. I'm sure we are, in fact, aware of that. So moving from that to some quick insights in relation to what radicalization and the radical thought is all about. Firstly, radicalization and radical thought does not necessarily lead to violence. We have to be understanding of this, or realize this, that there's a lot of people out there who might actually hold very radical views, but that does not mean that they are going to become violent. And we need to speak to officials, agencies, government officials, to make this point more clear through the research that in fact has already been done. There's plenty of research. I've given some research. I'll be happy to share this PDF and then that can actually go across to people. So there are plenty of research as far as this is concerned. Because why is this important for the government to know? I'm sure they do know, but for us to actually bring it up, for the media to know. So because there are a lot of people out there who might actually hold radical views. There are people out there who say, for example, who would be very passionate about Syria. There'll be people who are very passionate about Burma. And they might actually have very, very strong views about this. But that does not mean that they are actually propagating violence. Right? So we have to actually speak about this and make sure that this actually comes up into the mainstream discourse. And secondly, radicals are not automatically terrorists, and they have to be separated between the two. And we have to create the language to make sure that this is actually always separated between the two. And thirdly, that radical ideology is actually not the root cause of terrorism. We'll see a bit later on, and I will just make a quick point over here. The root cause of terrorism, which the world continues to want to ignore and neglect, is not radical theology. Radical theology, radical ideology is used to support the root cause, but the root cause is not radical ideology. The root cause, by far and large, is grievances of people. We cannot allow a discourse about terrorism to become this idea that somehow there are these extremists amongst us, and they happen to be naturally extremists who think like this and therefore psychologically just do this because they have no care for the human being. By far and large, this is not the driver of people who go from standard people to radicalization to extreme thoughts and potentially ultimately becoming violent. It doesn't make it right, but the reality is people have grievances, and I do not know how do we answer that in this modern world. And this is one of the questions I was asking before from the advisor in relation to this. How do we get the government to listen to these grievances? It's very important, because on the one hand, much of these grievances is legitimate, and we, in this entire discourse, I think we'll be doing the Muslim community a great disservice that if we simply say, oh, bunch of terrorists, bunch of extremists, let's reform them, without answering some of the root causes as to why terrorism actually exists, and doing it in a manner which is civic, and doing it in a manner which is transformative for such people, that they're able to make sense of the very thing they're very angry about. How do you turn that around is our job. But we cannot ignore where it all starts from. Right? Where it all starts from. Okay, so here is one pathway that I'm going to show here very quickly is by far the least number of people in the world by which people actually become radical or become extremists. And that is where they actually have an ideology. I suppose you have, even at ideology level, this is what we speak about, the theology. How do you develop a kind of a asserted sharia by which you explain to people this is what you're supposed to do. A very good person or good history to follow is, and I don't want to suggest in any way that this is in any way something that should be offensive to anybody, is to follow the situation that actually happened to Juhayman. You probably all know about Juhayman, right? Juhayman is a classic one to actually understand how ideology can in fact make a difference ultimately. But there's a very small number of people who actually ultimately follow through that kind of a pathway where ideology in fact is the basis by which they actually ultimately go and do the hard and heavy things. Unfortunately, the results that show us that if ideology is the basis by which how we're going to explain people why we need to be violent or why jihad exists. In other words, when we make our Islam political and then react to the political to that reality through this Islam's explanation of the political circumstances, Islam is more than politics. I'm sure we all know that. By far and large, 75%, according to Global Forum research, 75% of them exhibit extroverted hatred. In other words, they're outwardly hateful. They will say, for example, they look at, sorry, your name was? Annalise. I'm assuming that you're not a Muslim. No. Right, so someone like you, and sorry to pick on you over here, they see you and they'll see you as an infidel. They don't even know you, right? It goes from this ideological move straight that they paint a picture on you, right? That's how they see you. And we've seen the examples of actually on television within Australia, right? When you do that, most people will go, actually, I don't want your friend anymore, right? They pull away from you. And so what actually leads these people to be is they're in fact isolated. But they isolate into their own like-minded people. And now you have not only one person thinking the same thing, you've got a bunch of people thinking the same thing. From there, You then have something that I think Dr. Abdullah and I were speaking that, and I think the first speaker was mentioning that in fact there's no such thing as a recruiting agency for extremism and terrorism. But we have to realize that in societies, I'm not quite sure in Australia or not, but certainly globally, there are people who are watching these isolations. They are watching the people who are in fact radicalizing. And they are then reaching out to bring these people into a kind of a chef-student relationship and validating their thinking, and therefore then moving from that into intended violence. In 100% of the cases where the people have gone through and acted on violence, have in one way or the other, and we'll see what there's two ways, that some superior actually gave them either authority or implied, okay, this is okay to do so. 100% of the time. And we'll look at, there's two potential ones. One is implicit, and I'll explain what that means, and one is explicit, and I'll explain that in the next chart. The next chart over here shows us three pathways that in reality happens. In my experience, of the 240 odd people that we have been speaking to, by far and large, to the extent I am very, very comfortable to suggest that, Assalamu alaikum Sayyidi. By far and large, and I'm very comfortable to say close to 100%, probably I shouldn't say 100%, let's say about 98% of the 240 people that we have been dealing with for the last 7 years, they all suggest that what led them to think in the manner they were thinking was some event in the world. In other words, the previous chart we saw was about ideology, it was about the theology, it was about the so-called Sharia, but that's a very small minority. By far and large, most of them are actually driven from some event in the world. And we will look in a minute as to what human quality in fact is in there that the psychologists in fact mention, which is quite profound actually, because sometimes we think that terrorism comes out of hatred, which, as I said, I just showed you, is actually a very small number. It is a very different virtue, a very different human condition that in fact drives people to do so, and we have to understand these things. On the one path, you have those people who have sincere concern for what's happening in the world. But sincere concern does not come out in any other way but through education. That's the reason why Islam asks us to bring about education. We need to educate our people. Without appropriate education, sincere concern, in other words, the concern they have will actually be marred by, stained by some other things that I'll speak about in a minute. If that sincere concern is nurtured, in other words, youth, if we are able to spend the time to then help these people to understand things in a holistic manner. So, for example, if we're going to talk about something like Africa, we can't just talk about the Shabab and what they're doing in jihad. We need to talk about the geopolitical circumstance that in fact actually exists even historically, which means our education base, at least at the mosque and hopefully at the schools, goes beyond just how to make wudu. We need to start teaching people, we need to actually bring international relations scholars into our masjids. People who are trained in these academic fields to explain to our youth what exactly is happening in this very complex world. If that holistic learning is in fact nurtured, you will see that these people move to positive action, what we speak of amal salihat. Here I want to use some examples for you that I can share with you, which is to me quite profound. Example number one. I had, and I apologize to mention Arab here, but I think it's very important in context to actually understand. A close Arab brother friend of mine, we actually had a tree planting program. I'm not quite sure if anyone of you actually following our environmental program or not, but we actually have already planted, mashallah, in New South Wales, 20,000 trees, mashallah. Now, this particular time, our council, who was supposed to dig the holes, the tractor broke. Friday afternoon, what do? I go to Lakemba, look for my big Arab brothers, mashallah. Said, hey, I just need to get some holes dug. And some brothers joined, but there was one of these brothers, obviously I'm not going to mention names, he said, Afroz, brother Afroz, stop asking me to dig holes in Australia. I hate this country. If I could, I'd bomb it. Straight to my face. So I said to him, don't worry about Australia. Look at me, Indian, weak, can't dig holes. Come and help me. And he goes, okay, for you, pick me up in the morning, I'll come and dig holes for you. Saturday morning I take him to dig holes. There's about 100 of us all together. From a hesitant, hands in the pocket on the side, just looking what's happening, realizing most people are not able to actually coordinate and get the hole dug properly, gets himself involved. By midday, he's leading the digging of the holes. By the afternoon, he digs 200 holes. Alhamdulillah. Praise to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, praise to God. We finish off, thank everybody, we move on. 2 weeks later, I get a call from him. He said, Brother Afroz, when's the next one? And I go, whoa, that's a big change. I thought you hated Australia. And listen to what he had to say. I hated Australia and I would kill in Australia. But the moment I touched the soil of Australia, I realized this was my home and nobody's going to hurt it. Example number 2. Every 2 years I take people on a camel safari into the middle of the deserts of Australia for 7 days. Phones, mobiles, internet, everything stripped off, and we live like the Sahaba. We live like the companions, radiallahu ta'ala anhum. That's what we do. This one brother, he came over there, who joined me because he wanted to actually come and experience and listen to why he wanted to come to the camel safari. Police department, please don't come and question me too many times after this, right? He wanted to come because he was going to spend time in the deserts of Afghanistan, and he wanted to learn how to tell time for prayer and how to deal with camels when he was in jihad there. That's why he came to our camel safari. He told me. Ahlan wa sahlan. Come over. He spent 7 days with me. I'm cutting the long story short over here because in this entire process is sincere concern for both of us. Holistic learning happening by making sense to this brother. He had 101 questions every single day. And allowing him to be positive in his action. He left in the 8th day and he goes, listen what he said. Astaghfirullah, I do not know what I was thinking about. I do not know what I did. I did not know what the desert did. But I do know that by the prophetic example of having sincere concern for the other and giving them the time to give them a holistic learning about Islam, not just our line, that we have to rise and transcend and be able to give a holistic understanding of Islam and allowing people to do amal al-salihat right here. Right here. It actually does change people. It does change people. And of the 120 people from the 240 have actually gone through this process over here. I know I'm cutting short on time. I want to use a slightly, give you 2 other directions that this could have gone to. And this is obviously from psychologists, and I have this line here is what I have seen happening. The model that actually is more holistic than the previous one is this one over here. The extroverted hatred we just talked about, that if you don't have the sincere concern, if you don't have the proper nurturing facilitation around a person, hatred, on the one hand, it can be extroverted, it will be hatred. If this is the case, you'll actually find a group of people and you'll actually have the same grievances with each other. And if you do that, it strengthens you. You then have the superiors out there, whoever they are, who validate your thoughts, your claims and your assertions, and it leads you to, at the very least, some path to action. Some path to action, hopefully not violent. But sometimes we forget this bit one over here. That's the extrovert. We tend to hear them on computers, on internet, on radio, on television. But it's this one over here that we don't tend to hear about. The introverted, depressed person, the alone person. He sits down on the computer and he learns from the various sources. And then he has validation by clandestine connections. In other words, he sends an email to some jihadist in Bosnia or whatever else, right? And gets the feedback from these people, and these people are the most dangerous people because they will most likely end to violence. These quiet, unfortunate people, the people who are unable to get the answers, they become so depressed, they have this cognitive crisis of confusion. And as I've said, of the people that I've spoken to, the reason why they say they're confused is because nobody is answering their questions. Not because that the event is so terrible in their mind that they want to go and kill people, but the event is so terrible and they can't make sense of it. Is that making sense? Yeah? And therefore intervention in that level, knowingly and unknowingly. Knowingly, if we knew people, we would speak to them. But it returns to what we do in our khutbah. It returns to what we do in our afternoon classes and evening classes. What are we teaching and what are we in fact inculcating into people, and how we are engaging the youth to in fact be responsive rather than just instructionally telling them. Islam is not only about tadris. Islam is very much about tarbiyah, and we need to be bringing this tarbiyah back into this entire equation. So these red dots over here on the top and the bottom is really about radicalization. People who are helping each other radicalize, but in the middle path it's about mentors. It is about the murabbi. It is about you who can play this role. And I want to mention to you that don't ever think that simply because you're able to change one person that is too little. It's not. If I have been able to in 7 years change, I think, 120 people, I'm sure you, as mashallah, much better people, can do a greater job than that. If we can actually invest our time in this thing. And here is the critical point. It was not hatred, and something I think the first speaker spoke about. It's not hatred that's driving them. It's empathy for the brothers and sisters who are being killed out there. And we need to bring this to mainstream understanding, governmental understanding. We can't be reactive. We need to be responsive by letting people know in a constructive, productive manner that we do feel. And in that, if I can also mention, if I'm an Arab, please think about Burma. If you're a Burmese, please think about Syria. Whatever. In other words, don't become tribal-centric, because that's the other problem in the Australian society, that we are sometimes dismissed because we tend to be only outwardly caring about our own people of our own background, and that's another problem that media often complains about. In fact, that whenever we speak about an Indian, he only wants to talk about Kashmir. If you want to speak about an Arab, he only wants to speak about Iraq or Palestine or something like that. So we have to be careful of that there as well. Just last slide over here, inshallah, a couple of slides. Actually, I'll move out of here because this is probably just a repeat of the same thing in some more detail. Sorry. Okay, so let's move on to community strategies over here very quickly. So I'll return to some of the things that we need to actually get onto, and I hope that you did not expect me to give some short answers. I'm sure you didn't. I didn't come with the matrix red pill or the blue pill to fix any problem up. I think that we have to actually make sure that we need to return ourselves and review what are we doing in our mosques, what are we doing in our centers. We need to bring back holistic education. When I'm talking to this 240 people, the only seerah they know, and I'm not making this up by the way, the only seerah they know, the only seerah they knew was a seerah, the biography of the Prophet ﷺ about the Ghazawat. Problem, right? So we have to move to holistic education for our young ones. Secondly, we have to be transformational. In other words, we can't just tell people make wudu and that's it, or do this, or jihad, etc. We need to teach people how this is going to help you make a better person with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with God Almighty. It needs to be beyond instructional. It needs to go into mentorship. We need to become mentors for our young ones. We cannot just be instructors we need to be mentors. Thirdly, as I said before, we need to move away from and beyond the barbecue camps. We need to move away from barbecue camps. We need to do some serious kind of action with our youth that helps them to reach into their inner soul to understand who they are. And all of that energy that is being built up with the deserved energy in themselves for all of the problems of the world, we need to be able to get them an ability to do good things. I have people who I know would never plant a tree. I mean, these people are like, muscled up guys who guys don't go planting trees half the time, right? At least in the Muslim community, right? But they do it because they have been getting the holistic education. They have been shown how they can change their lives for the better. And they're not only being involved in some barbecues, but actually being involved in actual civic involvement, which allows them to do good things in their society, in their community. And I think this is something which you and I have to play a great role on. We have, mashallah, easily a number of people in this room here alone who can be voices for advocacy. And we need to go beyond reacting to media. We need to be responsive and we need to be creative. You probably had seen a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, there was a Lift Out Islam in Australia. That was the initiative of three brothers who hammered Sydney Morning Herald, the capital, like, oh, we got to do a story. And these three brothers actually went and took photographs, etc., and presented an entire package to Sydney Morning Herald to the extent where they then ran a one whole week of features on Islam in Australia. We did the brothers actually did an estimation of how much it would have cost if we actually had taken an infomercial, an advertisement for that. It of course was about $500,000, $500,000 actually to run all that information, right? Why? Because they were proactive. And I think that we as Imams, community leaders, we have to put aside this idea that the media is our enemy. We need to rise to the challenge and take them on in a manner which is proactive with them. We have to start writing stories for them. They love if somebody else does their job. Write the stories and give it to them, right? I wrote a story. They contacted me about a year ago. They said, look, write a story on Ramadan. I said, who's going to read that in Sydney Morning Herald, right? So I wrote an article about healthy eating. Healthy eating, and in it I spoke about Ramadan. Right? You have to think and be creative as to how you're going to get the message of this good religion that we have and how others can in fact benefit. Whether they want to adopt it or not is a different point. That's not what I'm talking about here. That they can take from this religion at least the ethics of it. And finally, the discussion, if I can mention that I think we have to keep on speaking to the government, to the officials. There's got to be policy reviews in so many areas. I think tomorrow we actually have the anti-terror laws person actually speaking, the foreign affairs in how we have to be politically active. I'm not suggesting that we stand for politics. I'll leave you guys to make the decision, inshallah, guys and girls, inshallah. I'm simply saying that we have to be politically active to bring about discourses on the table that everybody else is doing, but we are not doing yet. Secondly, we need to start asking the government to go beyond small grants. We need to, institutionally fund institutions here. NCIS is a classic example. We need to stand behind it, and many other initiatives. In fact, is actually coming up that we need to actually, stand behind. We need to go beyond these short grants. According to the New South Wales statistics, around about 7 out of 10 of all programs which are started through a grant fail. Because after 2 years or 3 years, there's no more grant, and what are you going to do now? If you look at the Christian model in Australia, by the way, the Catholic and the Anglicans had to fight for. The government did not just hand out to them, dollars and cents. They actually had to fight for it. They actually had to lobby. And what did they do? They invested into institutions, and we need to do the same thing. We need to ask the government and the authorities to help out. And we need to actually, get the government to actually be positively engaged with us, not just token presence. We need to have consultations at a higher level. The National Imams Council needs to create an actual portfolio to be able to actually get the government to sit down and listen to what we've actually got to say. We need to plant the seeds now. We need to do that now, even if it might not be actually happening. And I know this is the hard part. We need to keep on asking the government to change their paradigm about what Islam is, and the media about what Islam is. I know it's the hardest thing to do, but we need to make sure that if we continue to give the governments, the authorities, the media, and again coming back to this forum that we have over here, the website that we will inshallah create, that there is an actual resource facility of fact sheets, for example, that has been approved by a collective of Australian Imams that suggests that, this is what Islam says. And whatever the minority opinions are on the side and people want to claim about the whole thing, but the collective of the people of leadership of this community actually agree with it. So we need to act to be actually changing the realities, the perceptions that in fact the government, the media and everybody else in fact is holding out there about Islam and certainly about Muslims. And the last point actually I wanted to make is this. We have to realize that there are global problems out there. But first and foremost, we are Australian Muslims. And we have not only a responsibility, but an opportunity to pioneer some incredible engagements and incredible relationships that help nurture a better society in Australia on the basis of our leadership. Not that we have been forced into a situation, but because we stepped up to it. Jazakumullah khairan, alhamdulillah.
Thank you very much, Brother Afroz, for this wonderful presentation. I'm sure you will agree that none of us actually slept, and we were all actually listening to every word of Brother Afroz. He is not presenting the standard view on a number of things, and that's refreshing too, because in the discourse over the last 10 years we have seen the repetition of the same discourse and ideas again and again and again. Now he's presenting a slightly different perspective. I think we can relate to a lot of that. Most of us could relate to a lot of that. And in our tradition, there are so many resources.